This section of notes, we're going to be looking at the major agricultural production regions of the world. Something that I want to kind of introduce before we get into your first subsection is that farmers in less developed countries, which are often referred to as LDCs, if you see LDCs, that means less developed countries. But farmers in LDCs rely on subsistence farming, while more developed countries rely on commercial farming. So you can identify agricultural production based off of less developed country or more developed country regarding if they're using subsistence or commercial. Moving into your first subsection, subsistence versus commercial agriculture. And what we're looking at there is kind of the difference between the two. Subsistence agriculture, which is your first picture here, is most prevalent in LDCs, and it's the production of only enough food to feed the families of the farmers, and then not having any surpluses to sell. That's the definition. Now, there's kind of some leeway there because a lot of subsistence farmers do trade their agricultural product for something else, for another good, but they're not doing it to make a whole lot of money. It's just for survival. And then on the flip side, which is your bottom picture here, you've got commercial agriculture. This is the production of food surpluses, with most crops destined for sale to people outside the farmer's family. So the people farming it are not looking to feed their families with that product. Most of the time they're looking to sell their product to other people. The system of commercial farming found in more developed countries is known as agribusiness, and you can see that there. Agribusiness, because farming is integrated into a large food production industry, that's what makes it an agribusiness. It makes it an industry, and looking kind of referring to the movie of Food Incorporated here. The percentage of people in agriculture in the world, you have more people in subsistence agriculture, which kind of seems surprising, but when you think about it, it takes more workers for subsistence farming than it does for commercial farming, because commercial farming is highly mechanized, it uses a lot of machinery, and that sort of thing, and so you're going to have more people to produce more goods in subsistence farming. The farm size between these two, the commercial farm size is going to be larger, the actual size of the acreage of the farm being used. Now we're going to take a closer look at subsistence farming in the section Subsistence Farming Subregions. The first area I want to look at is intensive subsistence farming. Intensive subsistence farming yields large amounts of output per acre through concentrated farming, but still only provides a subsistence living for farmers. In other words, you're not using a lot of land, but the land you are using, you're getting a lot out of that land because you're working it like crazy. These two pictures here kind of show you a good example of that. Basically, you're not wasting any of the land. It's still subsistence farming, but you're working the crud, excuse my French, out of that land. Intensive subsistence farming is found in large populations with concentrations in East and South Asia, which is kind of what this picture here in the bottom right is referring to. And what they do mainly in East and South Asia is wet or lowland rice farming. Wet farming is planted in dry land, then it's moved to flood zones. Rice is grown generally on the sides of terraced hills to allow flowing water to run over the plant. So you grow it, you plant it dry land, and then when it kind of comes up as shrubs, you can see it here. These pictures here, these are the parts of the rice that have been plucked and brought to these flood zones and then planted to get more out of it. This labor-intensive agriculture employs a lot of people and requires little capital to produce the food. In other words, it does take a lot of people to produce it, but it doesn't take a lot of money. Rice is very, very cheap to grow. It just takes a lot of workers. So again, this is subsistence, so they're not making a lot of money or any at all out of this, really. They're using it to feed themselves. Next thing I want to look at is shifting cultivation. Don't get shifting cultivation mixed up with crop rotation. It's two different things. Shifting cultivation is also known as slash and burn or swidden agriculture. SWIDDEN. It's all the same thing. Slash and burn is what I've seen it called more. This primarily exists in rainforest zones of Central and South America because this is where you're trying to get rid of the trees. So what farmers do is they clear the land by slashing the bark off of the trees and then burning them. You burn this land, you cut the trees down. You can see the trees cut down here, the trunks that are burned already, and then you can use that land. Now this eats up the land quite a bit because you're destroying rainforest, and these zones don't have a lot of vegetation to hold the soils down, so it not only destroys a lot of rainforest, but it also kind of destroys the earth's surface in these areas because these areas are now exposed when they used to not be because they were covered by trees. And another part of slash and burn is intertillage. Intertillage is the growing of various types of crops by the process of planting between the rows of crops. You see a lot of intertillage once you've burned the land, once you've had slash and burn. And you can see this guy here is creating these tillage marks in the land. He's tilling the land, and then he's planting in between these tillage zones. And you can see the crops here that are already there. But you're creating these tills in the land, and then you're planting in between them, which allows for rainwater to settle and for these plants to get more water because of that. Also, part of slash and burn techniques is what's known as the burning of debris for fertilizer. And a lot of times what you have is potash, which is my picture here in the bottom right, as a fertilizer for people who are farming by hand. And it's more of a natural type of fertilizer that you could find, but it's debris that's been burned, and then nowadays it's been processed to be fertilizer. The next thing we'll see, next type of subsistence farming, is pastoral nomadism. This alternative sedentary agriculture is characterized by following the herds, also known as transhumance. That's the type of diffusion that's going on. With both shifting cultivation and pastoral nomadism are referred to as extensive subsistence agriculture because they involve large amounts of land but then minimal labor per unit of land. Both product per land unit and population densities are low in extensive subsistence farming. I'll write that here for you. Extensive. Now, I've got a verses here. Your extensive here in the top left, again, there's a lot of land being used, but the land itself that's being used is not being used intensively. Hence, on the flip side of this, in the bottom right picture, in your intensive type of agriculture, you have a lot of cultivation of small land plots through great amounts of labor, and then you get higher yields per unit. Like this group of people right here, the amount of land they're using here versus here is less, but the amount of yield that they're getting out of this land is more because they're putting more work into it. And that's kind of the difference here between intensive and extensive. Now, last thing I want to look at is Esther Bowsrup's theory. According to economist Esther Bowsrup, she said that subsistence farmers intensify production by leaving lands fallow for shorter periods of time and adopting new farming methods. Basically, what she's saying is in subsistence farming, you don't leave the land fallow, meaning you don't leave it alone for very long. You don't allow it to regrow. You intensively use it and come up with new methods of using it so that you can produce more. And this model here that we've got, remember we talked about Thomas Malthus and his idea that food production is stable while population is increasing, which is your red line here. And basically what Malthus said was that at some point your population was going to get higher than your food production. But Bowsrup is one of those people that said, yeah, Malthus, you're actually wrong. because the amount of food being produced is actually growing because of these new farming techniques. Because the idea of leaving land fallow with subsistence farming is not around anymore, or it's not being used as much. And so they're coming up with new techniques to grow the amount of food that's being produced. Then we move on to commercial agriculture subregion. Remember, commercial agriculture is when farmers and ranchers are trying to sell their output. They're trying to sell what they make. They're not living off of it. First thing I want to look at is mixed crop and livestock farming. This is the most common form of commercial agriculture. Most farmers here practice what's known as crop rotation. This is where each field is planted on a planned cycle. Different crops take different nutrients, so they make more intensive use of their soil. And you can see a picture of that there at the top, kind of the rotation of these, of where your grains are, and then where some of your other things being grown. You can see where it's moving in different plots of this land throughout the time. So you're rotating it to get the most out of your soil in crop rotation. An example of this is one cycle may focus on cereal grains such as oats, wheat, rye, or barley. A second crop may feature a root crop such as turnips. A third crop could be the rest crop such as clover. That's used a lot of times. This may be eaten by cattle, but it allows the soil to kind of rest because it doesn't take up as many nutrients. And then the farmer can then start over. Cereal grains are grown in the greatest quantity worldwide. And I've got a picture here on the left of what cereal grains look like. Again, this is the crop that's grown in the greatest quantity worldwide, meaning there's more of it produced than anything else. Now moving on to number 2, dairy farming. This can be found in outlying large urban areas where their products are away from cities. This needs to be close to the markets because milk can spoil quickly. So a ring of milk production surrounds a city, and this is known as a milk shed. In other words, the milk shed is the region that's close to a city where you have a lot of dairy farming going on, where farmers are producing milk, just because of the time it takes to get the milk to market, because the milk can spoil more quickly. And again, it's called dairy farming. You're not raising cattle anymore because it's an industry. It's mechanized, and you can see that in this picture here. You no longer have the guy sitting on the pail milking the cow because that takes too long. Can't get as much milk. It's an industry. Now moving on to grain farming. The most important grain-producing areas in the world are in the United States in 3 different regions. You have the winter wheat area. This is in Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma. This is where the crop is planted in the fall or the autumn, and it survives the winter and then ripens the following summer, and it's harvested in the spring. The spring wheat area of the Dakotas and of Montana, this is where the winters are too severe for winter wheat, and the Palous region of Washington State. The prairies of North America are often referred to as the world's breadbasket because of the amount of grains that are produced. And on this map here, on the bottom right, you can see the breadbasket here in the Great Plains region of the United States. Again, it's called the world's breadbasket because it's where most of the grains of the world are produced, such as what you see in this picture here. Then we move on to number 4, livestock ranching. Ranching is the commercial grazing of livestock over an extensive area, and it is often practiced in arid or semi-arid regions where climate conditions make crop production impractical. In other words, ranching can be found in most areas where there's not enough rain to really grow crops, but enough rain to create grasses for cattle or goats to graze on. Western United States, known as the West in the perceptual region of the world, you have a lot of ranching going on. In South America, you have large portions of the Pampas, Pampas. This is the Prairie regions of Argentina, You can also find it in southern Brazil and Uruguay. And this picture here is actually taken from one of the Pampas regions. Then we move on to Mediterranean agriculture. Now this picture is pretty blurry and you can't really read down here at the bottom what it's saying, but that's fine. I wanted you to get a visual of what the Mediterranean region actually is. There is one region this map does not show, and that is in California. There's a section of California that actually has a Mediterranean region. But Mediterranean agriculture exists in lands that border the Mediterranean Sea, such as this picture, and also California. You also have portions in southwestern South Africa, in southwestern Australia, that are Mediterranean region. You have some livestock raised in Mediterranean regions, but most agriculture is used for human consumption. I have a vocabulary word associated with this region, and that is horticulture. Horticulture is the growing of fruits, vegetables, and flowers. The major crops produced in the Mediterranean region are olives, grapes, fruits, and vegetables. Might be important to know. Now moving on to commercial gardening and commercial fruit farming. Commercial fruit farming and commercial gardening is predominantly found in southeastern United States region. This is a region that has long growing seasons and a humid climate. And then you also have accessibility to large markets of the Northeast. So you've got a great climate for growing, you've got humid, wet air, and then you have the markets of northeastern United States and the New York area where there's a lot of people and customers willing to buy. Commercial fruit farming is often referred to as truck farming because truck originally meant bartering in English. And so people were bartering for these types of crops. You also might be easy to remember truck farming because when you think of truck farming, like people selling things on the side of the road, generally if it's in regards to agriculture, it's probably fruit, something that the farmer just kind of grows on the side for a little bit of money and they sell it out of their truck. But initially the word truck farming was coming from the bartering of the English language. Then we have plantation farming. A plantation is a large farm that specializes in one or two crops. Today, plantation farming can still be found in parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Now, today's plantation farming does not have slaves. All are crops that are raised for export to high consumption developed countries. These are called cash crops because these crops are raised to make money for their owners. Plantation farming is a colonial legacy, meaning it came from the colonial times. Some plantation crops, which might be important to get down, hint, hint, are cotton, tea, rubber, and sugarcane. These are some plantation crops that are very, very important in the world. And you also have coffee that can be thrown in there. But cotton, tea, rubber, and sugarcane are your main plantation crops. This type of commercial farming is found primarily in developing countries because they're not yet developed. They're raising these cash crops to sell to the developed countries. Now I'm adding one subsection to your outline, and you can title it D, Regions Products Came From. Kind of give you a brief look at where some of the world's crops are raised and where they come from. A Mediterranean climate, a lot of the times the crops you get are olives, grapes, dates, figs, raisins, and in California, you can get lemons. Now, I don't want you to have to memorize all of these, but it might be important to get these crops down. California's Mediterranean climate is different because they have to irrigate to meet needs such as rain that the Mediterranean crops get. So that's one big difference between California Mediterranean crops and the actual Mediterranean Sea area is California Mediterranean region relies heavily on irrigation. Now, lands around the equator, they have longer growing seasons because they receive more amounts of direct sunlight, something to keep in mind. Areas in northern Africa, coffee was domesticated here some 1,200 years ago, and it's still important. A rule of thumb to remember is the locations farthest away from large bodies of water have the most extreme climates. So the further you are from large bodies of water, the more extreme climates you have. And then in southeastern Turkey, this is probably where wheat was first domesticated because of its Mediterranean type of climate. I know that seemed random, but some things that we needed to add.